Good morning. Today we're going to look at Hosea chapters 4 through 13. And these chapters are kind of all over the place. And a lot of people say that that's because that's just the way Hosea wrote. But others say that it's because they were sorted after he wrote them, that they were kind of edited. And there's a debate about that. I am going to use the layout to talk about the rest of Hosea that Mrs. Johnson uses. And Mrs. Johnson was the founder of Bible Study Fellowship, which is an awesome organization, really got me hooked on deep diving into scriptures. She uses 4 themes, and we're going to look at those. So I need you to read chapters 4 through 13, and you might do this over a couple of days. And if you've got 2 color pens, that would be great if you're a person that marks up your Bible. And the first thing you're going to highlight is everything that Israel does wrong. Okay, this is going to be primary color. You're going to use it a lot. And it would be starting with chapter 4, verse 1. There's no acknowledgement of God. And then maybe use a different color every time you see something that's a punishment. 4 verses 6, the people are destroyed. So go ahead and read chapters 4 through 13 as you wish. Okay, the first theme that Mrs. Johnson highlights is the indictment of Israel. Basically, all the charges brought against Israel, everything they've done wrong. And the first indictment is kind of the source of all the other indictments. It's kind of the umbrella over the others, and it's ignorance. The ignorance of not knowing the information given by God. Verses chapter 4, verse 1, 14. Chapter 14, verse 9. In Deuteronomy, the king is, Deuteronomy 17:19, the king is instructed to read the book of the law every day. And in Deuteronomy 31:11, every 7 years the people are supposed to be have the books of the law read to them. So this ignorance is it's the people's fault. It's not and the king's fault. So the ignorance is the basic under everything. And the second part of the ignorance is the ignorance of a personal relationship with God. Chapter 8, verses 2 and 4. Chapter 11, verses 3. They just didn't realize that it was God. The things that were happening to them, the blessings, they didn't realize it was God. The second indictment is idolatry. That's pretty obvious in Hosea. The golden calves and the Baals. And that's verses 4:19, chapter 8, verses 11 and 13, chapter 9, verses 9 and 10. 8:11 talks about the altars used for sinning. God's altars. So Mrs. Johnson made an interesting comment here about in the Old Testament and the New Testament, there's 2 basic laws: love the Lord your God with all your heart, and then love your neighbor as yourself. But in our society, we kind of have pushed the love your neighbor as yourself to be the first commandment, and the love your God as second. But foremost is love the Lord your God. And sometimes I think we forget that. We look at these people like they're crazy, but so are we. The third indictment would be the false priests and prophets. So again, God's indictment is always worse on the leaders. But the people were also kind of held responsible because they chose their priests and prophets at this point. There's no Levite. This is just, I want him to be my priest. I want him to be my prophet. And they're just kind of rough guys. chapter 4, verse 9 and verse 5 and 9, and chapter 6, verse 9, it talks about the priest lying in ambush. Chapter 9, verse 7 and 8. The fourth indictment is insincerity in sacrifice. And Hosea talks about God desiring acknowledgement rather than burnt offerings in chapter 6, verse 56, and 8, verses 13. The fifth indictment is the politics. Okay. They had evil kings, chapter 7, verse 3. They didn't rely on God, chapter 7, verse 7. They set up kings instead of God, chapter 8, verse 4. There's many others. And this all goes back to the fact that the people wanted a king. God didn't want them to have a king, but he allowed them to have a king. And he told them it's not going to work, and it didn't. And then their political affiliations. So the affiliation with Assyria in chapter 5, verses 13 through 15. In Egypt, chapter 7, 11 through 13. And among other nations. So she sold herself to lovers, and she sold herself to these other nations in chapter 8, verses 9 and 10. Also, there's just, within this political theme, there's this lawlessness, this robbery, this fraud. The chapter 4, verses 2 and 6, 8, and 9. Chapter 7, verse 1, breaking into houses. Geez. The sixth indictment is a moral indictment, and again, this kind of goes back to the idolatry, the sexual immorality. These people were, they had prostitutes as a part of their worship, and it's probably one of the more predominant themes, along with idolatry, in Hosea. Chapter 4, verse 10 and 18. Chapter 5, verse 4 talks about prostitution of the heart. Chapter 7, verse 4, drunkenness. Chapter 4, verse 11, just immoral indictment. Swearing. Chapter 4, verses 2 and 15. So Israel is, they're pretty bad. They're pretty bad. That's the first thing. Here's everything you've done bad. And the second theme, which you might have done in a different color, is, okay, here's what's going to happen. Here's your punishment. And Hosea wanted Israel to know that her suffering wasn't just one of those things. It was a deserved punishment, and her logical consequences and consequences of God. So this is in chapter 4, verses 5 and 9. Chapter 5, verses 2, God says, I will discipline. God is doing this. Verse 10, 12, 14 of chapter 5. Chapter 13, verses 8 through 11. And 15 through 16, the wind is coming from the Lord. This is not just one of those things. This is God's punishment. And the third theme is God's steadfast love. Might want to reread chapter 11, verses 1 through 11. It's like a mom who loves her child, but still wants to reprimand the child, to teach the child to be responsible, to be able to fit into God's kingdom. Chapter 11 is a great example of that. In verse 8 it says God's compassion is aroused. He doesn't really want to punish these people, but they have really stepped over the line pretty far. For some extra reading, if you want to read 2 Kings 17, it talks about how Israel is captured. Tomorrow we'll talk about the restoration of Israel, the fourth theme, and finish up Hosea.